You're listening to Non-Toxic. I'm your host, Daniel Penny. And this week, we have a little bonus episode. The intrepid producer of our show, Andrew, is reporting from the Society for Environmental Journalists about what he's learned and the tour he led and some useful polling insights for the 2024 election. As always, Non-Toxic is supported with the help of our listeners, and we need your support now more than ever. If you'd like to keep detoxifying the discourse, go to patreon.com/non-toxic-podcast and sign up to become a supporter today. We're already planning season 3. Keep your ears to the ground for more news from Non-Toxic. And without further ado, here's my conversation with Andrew. What's up?
What's happening?
You're growing a beard, my friend.
Went on my trip and I forgot my razor and then just never picked it up again.
Very nice. Very nice. I see a few flecks of gray in there as well.
Yeah, the side's real bad.
That's wisdom right there.
Wisdom and stress.
So thanks for hopping on this call. I'm really excited to hear about how the Society for Environmental Journalists weekend was.
This year was the biggest group ever, apparently, over 1,000 people. And they get sent out on bus tours around the region to learn about different environmental topics.
And you led one of the tours, right? So how did that go?
Yeah, I led the Bayshore tour, which was kind of loosely based on my book that I wrote back in 2019.
The Drowning of Money Island, for listeners who are curious. Check it out.
The Drowning of Money Island, that's right. Sold a few books in the process there, so it was nice. But no, it was good. We visited Money Island, in fact, and we talked to one of the main characters from the book, Tony Novak, who has dealt with the state in a lot of different capacities with regard to the state's buyout effort, and then just general environmental situations there with regard to sea level rise, a lot of flooding, major flooding issues there.
And for listeners who haven't read the book yet, what do you mean buyout? Like, why is the government trying to buy him out, and what is that about?
So buyouts have been around for a while, and they're property buyouts, and we're talking about voluntary buyouts here. In this case, New Jersey started a program back in the 90s for voluntary land acquisitions called the Green Acres program. So people could sell their land, farmland, and otherwise to the state, and that land would then be preserved forever, so it can never be developed. And they also started a few years later a floodplain acquisition program. So the program got a major boost after Superstorm Sandy, like millions of dollars for more acquisitions, and the state really beefed up staff and really aggressively went after places that got wrecked by Sandy. But sort of the crux of my book was that they went after lower income places because they,
stretch their dollar further.
That's right. It's cost benefit. I learned a lot about cost benefit in writing that book. But so they stayed away from the Jersey Shore where real estate values are very high, and they went after middle income, low income places. And the Bay Shore of South Jersey is basically low income. I wouldn't even say middle income. And Money Island was one of the more destroyed communities from Sandy. That area of New Jersey got overlooked as far as press coverage, but they got really slammed by 12-foot storm surge there. So the community in Money Island became sort of a thorn in the side of the Blue Acres program in New Jersey because the people didn't want to leave. They made bumper stickers that said no retreat, and they were very aggressive towards the state and the program case managers that would come and try to talk to them about selling their homes and that kind of thing. And Tony, I don't think Tony was the most aggressive in the community, but he is by far the most stubborn. So everyone eventually relented and sold their properties to the state, and Tony never did. And he still hasn't. He's still there.
So he's like the hermit of Money Island now.
Yeah, he doesn't live there full time anymore. He does, in full disclosure, he and his wife have a house in a little town called Millville, which is like 20 minutes away, upland, obviously. So this is kind of like his his little retreat. It's actually a trailer, like raised up on cinder block, but he refuses to leave because it is really beautiful. It's a beautiful place down there. It's gorgeous. And he not only owns the property that his trailer's on, he owns several more. So during the administration of Chris Christie, the Department of Environmental Protection was really aggressive towards people on the Bay Shore. Tony was issued several, like, environmental violations that culminated in a civil lawsuit that threatened to, sue him in the amount of, like, $3,000 a day if he didn't comply environmentally. He never adhered to that.
So he's just stuck around. So you brought a bunch of journalists over to meet him.
Oh, not only did we bring 47 journalists, we brought the commissioner of the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection and the new head of the Blue Acres program. So it was something that had never been done before at Money Island, getting Tony in front of the powers that be. He got to tell his story to nearly 50 journalists, and the commissioner and the director of Blue Acres had to listen. That doesn't happen very often.
That sounds like an awesome thing that you got to lead, but I imagine there was a lot of hobnobbing and panels and all kinds of other stuff. So I thought maybe you could tell me a little bit about the insights you gleaned from hanging out with so many other environmental journalists at the SEJ. One of the other things that I saw that seemed noteworthy was the talk about like where young people are at with their interest in and belief in climate change, specifically that like young conservative voters think climate change should be a priority. How did that come up?
Yeah, so this was, for me personally, one of the most interesting aspects of the conference. It was a panel discussion, and the vice president of communications for the American Conservative Coalition, Carly Matthews, who is quite young herself, she talked a lot about, recent polling that they've done among young conservatives.
I think perhaps some of you in the audience covered the first Republican debate in August when a young member of ACC actually asked the question about climate change and whether or not Republican candidates for the highest office in our country were going to address the issue of climate and kind of calm the concerns that Republicans don't care about the issue at all. So I think that that's really indicative of where young conservatives are on this. And what I'll add to that is I think it's hard to say that climate would be the number one issue for young conservatives. I think you'd be really hard-pressed to find data that backed that up. But climate denial is an automatic turnoff for young conservatives. And we saw this really clearly this winter when we did kind of listening sessions with all of the Republican primary candidates, and we got a lot of backlash for hosting Vivek because of his comments on climate. And I think it ended up being a really interesting and educational conversation in which our president kind of pushed him and said, this approach to this issue, this outright denial that we need a strategy on climate, it's not going to work with young voters. And I think we all saw how that worked out for him. So
I guess I was shocked by how many young conservatives sort of think of climate as a big point of difference in their decision making when it comes to elections right now. And I definitely think that sort of older conservatives, maybe in DC, who are disconnected at the local level, I mean, I think they're missing whatever these polling numbers that the American Conservative Coalition is getting. They consistently find that young conservatives want to elect leaders who A, believe in climate change, and B, want to have climate, sort of front and center in their policy goals. What do you think? Maybe I was just missing it.
Yeah. I mean, I'm
Uh,
curious like what that means though, because it's like, would they choose to pay money for a heat pump? Like people often say like sustainability is a priority or climate's a priority. This comes up all the time in surveys about consumers. and their purchasing decisions. And Gen Z, when surveyed, will say that sustainability is like the number one or number two thing for them when buying clothing, but they are the largest purchasers of fast fashion
Hmm.
by far.
Yeah.
Their spending habits do not at all align with their stated beliefs and intentions. And so I kind of wonder to what extent that might be true in the case of voting, especially with self-declared conservatives. If they might, in a survey or in a focus group say, oh, the environment's important to me, climate change is important, but abortion is more important, the border is more important, the economy as they understand it, even though, of course, climate change is an economic question, but, the economy meaning like, how's my check looking this month? They're going to put those things ahead, it would be my guess, because that's what pretty much all voters have done.
Yeah. When
But I could be wrong. You also mentioned that there are a lot of Americans who don't vote at all that consider themselves to be environmentalists, which I thought was intriguing. Like, I would think of people who care about the environment as a fairly politically engaged group, but maybe I'm not talking to the right set of environmentalists. What was that all about?
Yeah, I think I should play you this clip. It's Nathaniel Stood from the Environmental Voter Project.
I'll just start throwing some numbers out at you. So, in Georgia was decided by 11,799 votes 4 years ago. At the Environmental Voter Project, we've identified 491,000 already registered voters who care deeply about climate and the environment, who have never voted before. Arizona was decided by about 12,000 votes. We've identified 240,000 registered voters who are super environmentalists who have never voted before. And if these numbers sound huge to you, first of all, they are, but let me give you some context. We have about 260 million adults in the United States. 240 million are eligible to vote, because not all adults are eligible to vote. About 220 million are registered to vote. 4 years ago, we had the highest turnout presidential election ever, and out of those 220 million registered voters, 160 million voted in the highest presidential turnout election ever. So think about that huge chasm of 60 million registered voters who don't show up, 80 million eligible voters who don't show up, and understand that when we're talking about people who care deeply about climate, disproportionately young, disproportionately people of color, disproportionately lower income, they're much more likely to be in that group of non-voters. And so as you think about where climate can make a difference, especially in the context of voter turnout, look at polling data and consider, what is the denominator here? Is it a poll of likely voters? Well, that makes sense. Politicians don't care about unlikely voters, but maybe, just maybe, all of the climate and environmental folks are in that unlikely pot. And so, yeah, turnout is going to be everything for the climate movement.
Yeah, he had some striking numbers as well, just talking about how the polling that they've done, climate and the environment, is sort of disproportionately skewed towards voters of color, Native American communities, in whatever line of questioning they pose. It seems to be of far more importance to those voters. But I think the point of that clip there is just a staggering amount of people that just don't vote in the United States. And if in fact there are that many voters that are telling them that climate is something that is a voting issue for them, and yet they're not actually voting, that's a big deal for a presidential election like the one that we're about to have in November, where the environment, maybe not climate, but certainly the environment, with Donald Trump, essentially promising to rip the EPA to shreds. People like that are critical to an election like this, and to hear that they may not vote, never have voted, it's pretty striking.
And did he offer any explanation as to the disconnection and how to connect with those voters, presumably for Democrats?
I mean, these are all sort of just polling groups that are talking. really is, and he is. And so their answer to that is, we just need more people like us on the ground knocking on doors.
Pay
Their
us more money to keep doing this. Yeah.
I think their message, so that's what they do. And then their message to the journalists in the room was to just, especially Carly, and it's a fair point, was just to, connect climate stories at a local level. Don't talk about parts per million and all of these very sort of nerdy in the weeds elements of the climate discussion, but just talk about basic things. Like, for example, she was saying, a lot of the people they talk to, the young people, they care about the environment, or they come to the climate change debate by way of being hunters and fishers, so to connect with them at a level that might be meaningful would not be to talk about how many, parts per million of CO2 is in the atmosphere right now, but to talk about what that does to, local streams where they fish,
Yeah.
or forest, that kind of thing. And that's a
Like, have
fair
you
point.
noticed that there are fewer fish in the streams? Like,
Yeah.
we can count that there are fewer, and like, isn't there like 1/3 as many birds as there used to be like 100 years ago? Like,
Billions disappeared.
that's crazy.
Yeah. Yeah. And if it's so then in that case, you can talk about how climate change has screwed up the migratory patterns of a lot of the game birds that they, like to hunt, that kind of thing. It's meeting people at their level. I mean, that's their message for sure. It's how they do their polling, and it's what they recommend for communicators like us to do as well. As I just wrap up a story about marine carbon dioxide removal, which is so in the weeds that I think about those clips, I'm just like, "What the fuck am I writing?" No one cares. No, people that care aren't gonna read that. So,
Well,
yeah,
depends on the day.
maybe one day they're gonna, wake up and wanna do a little marine carbon dioxide removal reading.
Well, Andrew, thank you for these dispatches from the Society for Environmental Journalists. I'm glad that one of us was able to be there representing non-toxic and getting the scoop from all of these interesting thinkers and policymakers and researchers, because I think, it can feel a bit lonely sometimes in the climate space, whether you're just like a journalist or wonk or in climate tech, or even just like someone who listens to this show and wants to know that there are actually thousands, millions of people who are working towards fixing what we can of this planet.
Yeah, it's a big ship. I think it's turning slightly. It's gonna take time. There are people out there that care.
All right, Andrew, thanks for this update of non-toxic. Listeners, stay tuned for more bonus episodes and more information about season 3 of Non-Toxic, which is in the works. Also, we would like to announce the winner of our listener survey, the lucky caller who won their own non-toxic t-shirt. And the winner is Laird, with his brother-in-law addicted to Formula One. Thank you, Laird, for calling into Non-Toxic, and thank you to all of our callers and all of our listeners who have been a part of this community. Keep listening. There'll be more to detoxify shortly.
Thank you, guys.
Non-Toxic is a production of Loose Thread Studios, hosted by me, Daniel Penny, with special help from our producer, Andrew Lewis. Our music is by Nathan Sharp, and our art is by Sam Creasy. If you'd like to keep Non-Toxic on the air, go to patreon.com/non-toxic-podcast and sign up to become a member today. Thanks for listening to this bonus episode, and keep an eye out for season 3.